Hi everyone, it's Munira here with Keep the Clarity. It is October 25th. It's 88 degrees in Texas. Gross. Anyhow, as promised, I am launching more videos. I know my channel is new and now I'm going to try my best to get a video out every Monday. For those of you who are new to this channel, I suggest if you want to know what this is about, watch the first video, the welcome video. It's going to go over a little bit about my intentions. But most of you know me from my work in the field of counseling and that world. I've especially been recently doing a lot of work on guilt and shame and how to work through those things. So today's video, I think, is going to be helpful for some of those topics for those of you who have been working with me and learning about how to get rid of guilt and shame or work through it. So today what I wanted to talk about was starting with the idea of stereotypes, norms, and traditions. So these are things that I think come into play when we start identifying who we are and we start choosing how we live life. The choices we make in life, I think a lot of times are influenced by traditions, norms, and stereotypes. So I wanted to talk about those things and basically bring to mind some questions you could start asking yourself to start seeing, like, hey, what's the source of these beliefs that I have that may or may not be true for me and how I should be living life. So that's a lot of kind of what the foundational work around guilt and shame is that I talk about, is how to kind of identify beliefs that you have about who you should be, how you should live life, and to challenge the ones that don't fit you anymore. So let's dive into this topic. Now, I'm not like a sociologist pro, so I know I'm not going to do definitions of these words justice. You can Google them. However, just kind of briefly, I wanted to go over the three words because I think they intersect and it's hard to sometimes define what fits into what when it comes to norms, stereotypes, and traditions. So, traditions, to start with, are generally just, beliefs or customs that are maybe rituals passed down from generation to generation. Stereotypes, I think we all kind of know what that word is, but it's very much like a image, we'll say, that's been placed on usually a group of people, maybe a community, maybe a society, but anyhow, it's an image, right, that's projected onto people, individuals, communities, based on something they have in common. And stereotypes, as we all know, can be really harmful, not always true, and they can be a blurry line between what's a stereotype and what is actually really a real experience for a culture. A lot of what I talk about, I mentioned in my first video that a lot of my videos I'm going to talk about the experience of being first generation born and raised in America, especially if you're someone who identifies as they see a lot of intersection with people who identify as Asian Americans, I would say. So I think thinking about stereotypes, I think those of us who identify in those populations can think about a lot of things that are stereotypes and, maybe even laugh about them and be like, hey, that's the true one in my culture. So when you're working with your own culture and identifying where stereotypes feel true, it can be really kind of tricky territory, right? So just want to acknowledge that as you go in and kind of think about these things. Norms basically become kind of like standards, right, of ways of living, things to believe in, ways to express yourself. So what are the norms of our society? What are the norms of your culture, basically, that have been adopted as like, and it really does filter in into like, hey, this is the right way to be. These are the right things to do. This is how you should be, right? So that's where the intersection comes in with a lot of the work I do with guilt and shame. These are kind of things that can be really unconsciously transmitted to us. Also, when we face discrimination based on these things, they can shape really our identity and how we express ourselves and how we're scared to express ourselves. So, thinking about all three of these things, really the main thing I wanted to talk about today was how to start questioning where they come from and whether or not they serve you. Is the foundation of these things, whether they're traditions that you learned, whether they're stereotypes that you see existing in your life or in your family, maybe they're norms that you've adopted in your life and you're starting to question them, is starting to think about where did they come from. And that's going to help really get to some truths that sometimes can be difficult around, like, hey, there's no reason for me to adopt this as my norm if it doesn't serve me, right? Things like that. So one of the things I wanted to talk about related to this is that things oftentimes develop out of a need for survival as a response to traumatic events, right? As a response to forced ways people have to evolve based on, going way back in time, like, most people of color have faced some sort of colonization in their heritage, right? So a lot of things that turned into norms of their culture were really actually changes that were made out of a forced need to adapt to a difficult circumstance. So let's talk about this more, maybe with some examples, and it'll help clarify. So I like to, like I mentioned, use examples in what's called the ABCD community. I know I mentioned I'm going to dive in and do a lot of videos about this topic in general. Today, since I'm kind of bringing it up for the first time, I'm going to take a little detour here and briefly talk about what ABCD is so I can use it as kind of a theme for some of our examples for today's topic. So ABCD, for those of you who haven't heard it, I'm laughing because I love it, this term and everything out there with it. But it stands for American Born Conflicted Deshi. So I identify as first generation born and raised Bangladeshi. My parents immigrated here from Bangladesh. And so basically I identify as an ABCD, American Born Conflicted Deshi. And the confliction has to do, or the conflict, I don't know if confliction's a word, has to do with the kind of inner battles that we face constantly around adapting to two different cultures, right? Being raised in America and also trying to oftentimes make our families proud, not shame the family based on their cultural norms and expectations. So there's probably so much. You probably could do research on this topic. There's movies about it, right? All sorts of movies, both American and Bollywood movies, right? So a lot of this relates specifically to people of Southeast Asian descent. And I think a lot of topics related to the ABCD community overlap with other experiences that people from other cultures face as well, being first generation born and raised in America. I'm just saying that based on people I've worked with and their stated experiences, and sometimes places that they felt like it overlapped with some of the things I talk about. So let's use this as an example. So one of the, call it a stereotype, call it a norm, right? Who knows, that I think a lot of people in the ABCD community face is this expectation and of being like scientists, doctors, right? There's expectations around what career path you choose and really what's valued there, right? Doctors, lawyers, engineers, primarily, at least what I've heard, doctors and engineers. So, and these are the roles where there's a lot of value placed on them too. It's beyond just like, hey, this is what you should do. There's a lot of value and status placed on these. And in contrast, not a lot of value, even some shaming that goes on when people choose other paths, right? So I thought about this for a long time. Like, where does this come from? Because if you look at the reality of here and now, at least in America, there's a lot of lucrative careers beyond those two. So it can't just be about like money, right? It also, there's some kind of obsession with science in there. But really, like, it's kind of, this is what I'm talking about. It's like you start questioning, like, where do these come from? Like, why did this become so important and such a box, like a limiting box people can be put in, right? So really, it's not like being a doctor or scientist or an engineer is like what really was at the roots of everyone's heritage, right? This is where the questioning should start. Like, what are the things really at your roots? Usually they're not about what brings in money, and they're sure as heck not about westernized medicine, a lot of times. I'm not, by any means knocking doctors and engineers, like, way to go if you're, a doctor engineer. Basically, I'm bringing up this topic if you're someone who doesn't like fit into that mold and maybe has, or a mold that you're kind of related to this concept, and you've struggled with that, right? So when you think about it, I'm not good at history, just so you know, but I remember talking to my dad once, and he was talking about how people look at status in Bangladesh, and one of the things that people look at is the color of your skin. This should be like a whole other video, but I'm going to talk about this briefly because it ties in to all of this history. And so basically in our culture, in a lot of ABCD communities, one of the first things that people look at when they're looking for like a husband or a bride is that their skin is fair. Yeah, if this is the first time you're hearing this, you're probably like, what? Um, so, so yeah, it's like a big thing to be fair skinned, and it really runs deep, and it's really sad, right? When you think about it, there's this image, this projected vision of beauty within our cultures that has to do with the color of your skin. So kind of almost like racism within our own culture. So a lot of this, where it came from, my dad was talking about it once, was that basically over time there's people started looking down on people who had lower status, meaning less money. People who had more money eventually ended up getting out of jobs where it was mostly like labor, right? Maybe farming and, being agriculture, building things, really hard labor. And so people who were rich got out of those fields of work, did things that were much more mental, right? And they were able to then stay in their house, right? And then they have servants there. So basically, the people who made less money were the farmers, people who ended up out working under the sun, and their skin was darker. And I know this isn't the one reality, but this is an interesting piece. Okay. And then the people who ended up being able to be lazy indoors and have servants had a lot of money, and their skin was more fair. They weren't out in the sun as much. So there's something at the root of the color of the skin that traces back to perceived status and wealth. This isn't the only thing, as I mentioned. There's also different areas in these countries where people are just born with darker skin, right? This is going to go back to way other forms of racism, as you can imagine, right? So thinking about this, let's tie this back into like, what is this thing about this kind of norm, even expectation that's been made about pursuing certain careers having to do with the sciences, right? And a lot of times labor intensive jobs are looked down upon, even if they make a lot of money. That's what's interesting, because you can make a lot of money doing things that are labor intensive. So so going back to this, when you think about it and you start questioning this for yourself, where it probably came out of is there was some kind of value that was placed on getting these certain kinds of jobs, and it came perhaps out of necessity, right? So when countries were being colonized, so starting with like India, and then India, and then there's Pakistan, and then there's wars, and then there's Bangladesh, right? Anyhow, different levels of colonization, British influence, these kinds of things, where people who were looking for opportunities to leave and come to America, there were things projected as what were the more valuable careers, right? And then the emphasis was being placed on things that were being modernized by white people, right? So shifting into focus on science and certain types of medicine, trying to let go of ancient types of medicine that were then looked down upon, right? And then really there's a lot of value, and then the value is connected to actually opportunities that are present in America, right? So a lot of the parents who immigrated out here in us ABCD individuals immigrated out here and were able to do so with opportunities that were in the sciences. So there was a high kind of connection, I'm going to say, to making it work and having success based on choosing these careers, right? And the value that was placed on them didn't come from the actual roots of the culture, right? When you look at the roots of the culture, there are so many things, right, that are beautiful in all cultures that should have real value, right? The first example that always comes to my mind are more ancient traditional medicines, um, that are inherently in things that have to do with being in nature, connecting with the earth, connecting with the herbs, connecting with, all of the natural elements and medicines. Another piece would be like things that are connected to spiritual practices, right? So we do see nowadays there's some more value being placed on these things. It's kind of like, people are seeing the value in these things, but we have yet to kind of see the scales tip towards in terms of what is like rewarded more financially, right, in our cultures and society, and also what's accepted more within the community itself for people in pursuing certain professions, right? So at least in the ABCD community, for example, I can clearly say that most people in my generation would agree that their parents would probably value you more if you were a doctor compared to like a yoga teacher, right? So anyhow, just a really slim example I'm giving here out of much more complex dynamics and a much more deep history. But I hope that's making sense. So the idea is thinking about what became a norm or a stereotype, maybe even a custom, out of actually a need for survival, right? So there's a value placed on something that's actually not inherently the truth of the beauty of the culture. And then those things get passed down, and we get all frustrated sometimes with the generations that push down on us with the expectations, but in a way it's kind of like what they learned as like, this is valuable and this is what's going to bring you success in your life, right? And so they're scared that if you pursue other careers you're not going to succeed. So you can tie this theme into looking at all sorts of things, right? Especially looking at where did people create and evolve new ways of being based on things that were experienced in the history that your culture or whatever you're looking at faced, that was quite traumatic, actually. Most people who end up in America in some way, shape, or form are projected certain values and expectations that are created by people who are white and privileged, right, and have become the more dominantly valued cultures, right? This goes down to so many things: images of beauty, images of success, things you should do, how you should express yourself, right? All of these things. So starting to question, where did norms and stereotypes come from? Traditions hopefully don't get tainted as much. However, I think it's helpful to look at those things as well. One last thing I wanted to talk about today was as you look into these things, thinking about, why is it so hard to shake these things? Why is it so hard to shake stereotypes that don't fit us? Why is it so hard to step out of norms that have been placed on us and live differently, right? Well, one, I think that these things just go way back, right? So in the examples I gave, you could imagine these go back generations and generations and generations of things that countries face, right? Even leading up to their independence, right? So many things overlap here when it comes to religion, culture, um, views on science, views on spirituality, all these things, right? So the fact that most things go so far back, I think, is why sometimes these things are hard to shake, right? It's like a tradition feels like strongly rooted for a reason because it goes back, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years. So sometimes these things can be really powerful too, right? Even things that are created out of a need for survival actually can be very impactful in positive ways too. So I don't want to mention only one side of like when people are forced to adapt, something negative is created. No, in fact, the opposite is true a lot of times as well. However, it's just interesting when you start looking at this stuff, right, historically. And so another reason why it's hard to shake is that people, I think, just get comfortable, right, in norms, right? If you're surrounded, it's kind of like that whole thing of like being a fish in a fishbowl, right? You know what you know, and to step out of that can be comfortable, and sometimes you don't even see it. So my hope is that this video makes you start like looking into the things that you've adopted as norms, right? Stereotypes that you feel like ring true in your experience, maybe with your family or your culture, and to start looking at, like, hey, why did this develop? Why does it exist? Is it actually still necessary? Right? Then bring in this idea of, like, what does it mean really to evolve my spirit, evolve my purpose, right? I had to sit down. It took me a long time personally to really sit down and, like, realize, like, hey, I can be financially successful if I pursue alternative art forms, healing art forms. It's possible. It took a long time to, like, just break the belief that that's not possible, which is essentially so much of what prevents us from success, are simply limiting beliefs, right? So when we have a belief based on a norm, sometimes we adopt it and it becomes a reality. So start questioning these things, especially if you know something that you're wanting to step into and you're worried about it, right? Think about, what is it? What's that voice outside of you? Maybe it's a voice from your culture, from your family, from society, telling you you can't do it, right? Really look into it and be like, why does this exist? Usually it's fear-based. Usually it's a desire to stay comfortable. Usually it's lack of people's understanding. Usually there's some kind of core of, like, racism or discrimination. So really question it, sit down with it. And what you'll find is that the things you want to step into are possible. So I hope this was helpful. I'm going to do my best to crank out videos every Monday, and to do that, just so you know, they're not going to be perfect, but I have so much that I want to share. So I'm excited to get these going. Again, subscribe to this channel, Keep the Clarity. You also can find me on Instagram at Keep the Clarity. All right. Be well.